Okay, and with that, I think it's time to get kicked off. So I'm going to start off by saying welcome all of you to another MassMEDIC webinar. This is the first webinar of 2022. I don't know about you guys, but it's hard to believe that we entered a new year, but it's really great to be back with all of you. I am Rachel Robinson, Vice President. Oh, I apologize. I have a new title now. I'm Chief Operating Officer of MassMEDIC. Sorry, that's brand new, and I just haven't gotten used to saying that yet. It's great to see all of you again, as I said. For what I know is going to be another fantastic program. So we are thrilled to be joined by Phil Palmer at Sunrise Labs for what is going to be a really interesting program on systems engineering. Systems engineering is one of those things that we've done a few webinars on with Sunrise and with other folks, and it's always such an interesting conversation and something that I know I learn a lot about each time. So I'm really excited to listen in on this with all of you. I do believe we will have time for Q&A at the end, so I recommend you use the Q&A button at the bottom of your webinar. If you send things through the chat, sometimes they get lost and it's hard for myself or for Phil to find them at the end, so please use that Q&A button. We will try to answer those live, and if not, we will have a record of those so that Phil can get you some answers afterwards if he needs to chat with his team at Sunrise Labs. So we couldn't do this without our partners at Sunrise Labs. We absolutely appreciate all of their support as members and sponsors and putting all of this fantastic content together for you. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Phil and say, Phil, go ahead and take it away.
Great, thank you, Rachel. I appreciate the introduction. As Rachel said, my name is Philip Palmer, and I'm a program manager at Sunrise. I've been here at Sunrise for about 5 years, and I've been doing medical device development and scientific instrumentation development for the better part of 20 years. So as she had mentioned, the purpose of this discussion today is the benefits of systems engineering and taking a systems engineering approach for medical device development. And I'm going to go over a couple main topics to begin with, and then we'll go a little bit more into the details of it. So first, what is systems engineering? We'll talk about that. Second is, what is the role the systems engineer plays in the development team? What are the benefits that system engineering brings to not only the device itself, but also to the program? What are some of the tools and processes that systems engineers use as part of the tools of their trade per se? And then we'll close with kind of a short discussion of why systems engineering and why there's a clear case for using it for medical devices. So medical device industry is trended towards more complex and integrated solutions. And these solutions, they often involve distributed technologies, disruptive new technologies, complex architectures, ergonomics, intuitive user designs, and in many instances, multiple development partners, not necessarily co-located. And that also adds a complexity that systems engineers can help address. The technical challenges associated with developing these technologies and these instruments, they really need to be balanced with the key business objectives, which is the whole reason you're developing a medical device. Effective coordination of team members of all the different engineering disciplines is really key to make sure that you not only enhance the product you're developing, but you can streamline that entire development process and reduce the time to market. So by utilizing a holistic systems engineering approach, you can really drive towards a commercially viable product faster, with higher certainty, and get a more robust product out at the end. So the first thing I put up was, what is systems engineering? And the systems engineer really is the glue that binds the team together of all the disparate engineering disciplines. And it's a systematic approach towards bringing a device from initial conceptualization all the way through to commercialization. So a good system engineer, they take advantage of what I would refer to as emergent functionality that arises when you take various different small parts of mechanical engineering, medical disposables, software engineering, and so forth, and bring them together where the sum of the parts is greater than each individual contributor. So that's the emergent functionality that I'm referring to. And it's a effective system engineer that can bring that to the forefront to the betterment of the project and the product. Excuse me. So the system engineer, what they do is they oversee a number of different things. One is the risk management. As a medical device, we need to make sure that we are effectively managing the risks that are identified in a hazard analysis or an FMEA, and we are mitigating them appropriately and tracing to requirements and verifying them, and we'll see that momentarily. We also need to facilitate technical discussions so that we make sure that all the team members are speaking to one another and they all understand the design intent, and that we can actually make sure that we realize the product has fulfilled that design intent. All right. And the systems engineer also within Sunrise oversees the creation of the design documentation. So this could be requirements, architecture documentation, design details, as well as, of course, configuration management and verification documents and so forth. It's also important to mention that, as I mentioned before, it's the commercializable product. So not only we have to interface with the engineers on the development side, we need to make sure that we consider manufacturability and serviceability so that the entire product life cycle is effectively managed from a design perspective. So the benefits of systems engineering. So there's a number of processes we'll go through in a momentarily, but what the effective benefit of applying systems engineering from the inception of the project is to be able to create more predictable schedules and budgets, to lower the total product cost. So it's not just about maybe the individual components, but it's also the manufacturing costs that go into it. So the burden cost of the device. You should be able to enhance the product's overall performance by taking advantage of the emergent functionality that I spoke to previously. Greater maintainability, serviceability, and as we get more into IoT, extensibility. How do we take advantage of technologies that are emergent and be able to leverage that in the future and think about that as we design the product today? Of course, as medical devices, we need to consider the FDA, the MDD, and other regulatory bodies. And as I mentioned, greater adaptability to unforeseen change. I've been doing this for 20 years, and I'm sure many of you have been doing it probably longer. And it is not uncommon for us on the Monday mornings, usually Friday afternoons, where we learn about something that we did not foresee. And a system engineer is better able to adapt that because they understand and have contact with all the different disciplines, and they can coalesce a team to troubleshoot that and come up with solutions easier than just individual contributors by themselves in a cube. So what this graph is trying to depict is that if one could evaluate the performance of a project and looked at what happens to a project and whether or not it's successful or not, or was a high performing project, and looked at what happens when you did not have systems engineers and when you did have systems engineers, the engineers being, in this case, systems engineers being the orange one, is you get a higher performance project when you add the systems engineers into both the planning, the architecture development, the requirements, and the verification. And what I find striking here is where the most value is gained, which is in the requirements and the verification. Those two things are inextricably linked. So as we'll talk about in a couple slides in the future, is that good requirements and an understanding of how to create good requirements is going to make your development process much easier. And if you've thought about verification while you're developing your requirements, it's going to make your verification much easier. So by having an effective system engineer guide that process, those two parts we're going to get the most value out. So what's depicted here now is a systems engineering process here that we use at Sunrise. It's an iterative process, not unlike the agile development process. And where we start with this is in the requirements analysis and management. So as I mentioned before, and I'll show you on a subsequent slide, is how are we managing the requirements, how are we recording the requirements, and how are they structured? We also talk about functional analysis. So once we have the requirements, we need to break them down into functional groups and allocate them to the appropriate engineering disciplines. Design synthesis is trying to figure out how we get from the functional blocks into actual implementation. System analysis and control. So just because you have an idea of how you would like to implement a project, what parts you would like to use, it's important to go through some mathematical processes to evaluate whether or not your ideas have merit, and if they don't, where they are missing the target, and you can iterate on that and address ideas ideally proactively instead of being surprised on the Friday afternoon, as I had mentioned before. And then, of course, lastly is verification. How am I proving to myself and all the necessary stakeholders that I have met the requirements put forth in item number 1? It's an iterative process, so we'll learn things along the way and adapt quickly to any changes that we think that we need. So now I'd like to focus a little bit about the requirements themselves. This is the first part of that SEPI, or System Engineering Process Engine, and it talks about the most important parts of requirements. So those are going to be obviously coming from the primary product owner, marketing requirements, user requirements, human factor, and of course we need to consider risk analysis, FMEA, and so forth. There's industry standards that need to be considered for this as well, and the regulatory bodies, and that goes into the requirements documentation and management. So what is a good requirement? And this is something that I've been wrestling with, both with myself as well as with all of my clients for the last 20 years, was what is a good requirement? And I'd first state that a requirement should tell us what the instrument needs to do, not how it should do it. So the instrument might need to move blood from one place to another. The requirement should not be use a peristaltic pump with 3 rotors. All right, that would potentially over-constrain the design team and inhibit them from coming out with some emergent solutions that might otherwise benefit your device. So the requirements should be unique. They should be complete. So if you're trying to span a range of operational performance, you need to describe the entire range, not just a subset of it. They need to be self-consistent. So one requirement should not be contradicting another. Unambiguous. So I don't wish to offend anyone, but requirements such as must be user-friendly could be ambiguous, because what is friendly to me as an engineer or me as a scientist may not be as friendly to a patient who has some issue or a debilitation. All right. Viable. So it needs to be achievable with technologies readily available or that we could see on the near horizon. Traceable. Why am I doing this requirement? Is an engineer just making it up out of whole cloth, or is it being pointed towards a product requirement or a marketing requirement? Verifiable. Can I test this? There's been a number of projects where I've worked on in the past where the requirement was written in such a way that I did not have the means, and the means to test it did not physically exist. So you want to make sure you understand that before you go about recording those requirements and getting sign off, because if you cannot test it, you might have a hole in your verification plan. And then, as I mentioned earlier on, implementation agnostic. Tell me what I need to do. Don't necessarily tell me how to do it. So earlier on, I said that sometimes what happens is we have either very complex projects, or we might have projects that are distributed over multiple development partners. And this is not uncommon for Sunrise. In fact, it's almost a regular occurrence where we might have 2, 3, or 4 different development partners on a single development project. So it behooves us to make sure that we effectively communicate which parties are responsible for which requirements, and a documentation tree, such as what I'm depicting here, indicates color code for each development party and how those requirements are traced to each other and are dependent on one another. As you get into and you add additional documentation to this from an organizational perspective, you'll also see where the design is linked to each one of these boxes, and the verification, so that not only can I determine who is responsible for the requirements, I can determine where their interface is from a design perspective, as well as from a verification perspective. And it helps me understand the totality of the program from a documentation perspective. So functional analysis and allocation. So we need to deal with all the risk mitigation activities driven by the FDA, ISO, and the Medical Device Directive. And then there's the determination of various different failure modes from an FMEA, and then the creation of documentation for those mitigating risks. So that's one aspect of functional analysis and allocation. There's trade-off studies where we're going to evaluate different design architecture proposals, and ideally one would be able to evaluate them against predefined metrics, and we'll talk a little bit about that shortly. Maybe there's individual components. My team and I just did this about 3 weeks ago for a project where we had 2 different motor drivers that we were trying to evaluate. We had the requirements that were written down, of course, and then we had various different considerations for the motor driver. What's the cost? What's the availability? And in this day and age, the availability is what largely drove our design, but that may be a different story. But make sure that it meets all the criteria, and there might be some criteria that are more important than others. So be able to enumerate those and assess the particular components' ability to meet those attributes that you define as important. Make versus buy and cost benefit analysis is important. There's been many projects I've worked on where, while it might be easy to make something, it just may not be cost effective to do that, depending on who your other development partners on and how many we're making, and what our confidence is that what we're making will have no design iteration in the near future. And then, as I mentioned before, service and manufacturability. I think we've all could tell stories about the devices we've worked on in the past. And one I remember where the design was, from an engineering perspective, I would say it was very elegant. Unfortunately, did not consider how it would be manufactured and the environment that I was operating in, and how the service organization that was going to support that was going to work. So that design may have worked well in a different manufacturing setting and a more elaborate service support capability, but that did not exist at that prior company. We need to consider these things. Who is supporting it? What's their skill level? What access do they have to it? Will that access be remote, or will it be something that they're on site? These things need to be figured in when we're doing our trade-off studies. So here's a functional block diagram, and what its intent is you take the requirements and you determine how those requirements will be fulfilled from a functional perspective. So in this case, we have our patient on the left. There's going to be some data collected from their blood or galvanometers, blood pressures, and so forth. That data will have to be processed in some central location. The data is going to have to be transmitted to a centralized data system, a cloud-based system in this case. And then there needs to be some type of power conditioning and or portable battery source. So these are the primary functional blocks. It doesn't say how we're going to achieve that. It simply says these are the things that will need to be implemented at some point, and it gets the engineering team thinking about what the architecture of the instrument is from an electronics perspective, from a software perspective, and from a usability perspective as well. Once that is done, the next step would be moving on to, excuse me, physical block diagram. So this is the next step in that iterative process. So yes, we do understand we're going to have sensors, and we're going to plug them into an independent analog front-end board. And the reason we're going to plug them into an analog front-end board is potentially because they're very high sensitivity electronic signals, and we need to segregate those signals because of the noise environment from the embedded processor. So that is where the systems engineer is able to take experience and knowledge about the various different disciplines and coalesce those team members around an architecture to facilitate the end goals. Now, this is an iterative process, because what will invariably happen is as the engineers come up with a solution, each time you go through that iterative SEPI engine, we have to assess the device for risk as well as other trade-offs. And you might find out that there might be something in the analog front end, while it meets all of your electrical performance requirements, it may not meet other considerations. Maybe it's too large, maybe it generates too much heat, maybe it doesn't have sufficient throughput for the processors and communication pathways that you've identified, and you need to go through that loop again until you've addressed those concerns. So earlier on, I was mentioning that what you'd like to do is be able to quantitatively evaluate various different proposed designs. So the engineering team will be looking at that physical block diagram, and they'll come up with a number of different ways to achieve that. There's going to be trade-offs that are made, and by putting these trade-offs onto a Pew matrix, one could evaluate each of the concepts relative to some key attributes. So what should happen is you should have a product owner. Maybe it's maybe it's the client marketing personnel, maybe it's the client's VP of engineering. That needs to be determined up front who the product owner is, and the product owner is going to define what are the critical attributes that they are concerned about, and what is the priority of those attributes. Maybe signal integrity is absolutely critical. Sensitivity to noise is absolutely critical. Maybe data rate is less important. They don't need a kilohertz worth of data. Maybe 100 samples a second is satisfactory. The noise floor is what's important, and that would have to go in here. Once the client or the product owner provides those attributes and those weighting criteria, the engineering team could assess each of those attributes against a numeric value. Now, oftentimes what I've found is that it is helpful to utilize a non-linear quantification process. So using numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, what's invariably going to happen is that the small differences that you have, you're not going to be able to really see a difference at the very bottom line. And there's typically bias. So one engineer invariably is going to try to migrate their idea to the top, and they'll push it from 3 to 4. And you as the decision maker would like to be able to not have 3 or 4 ideas that are only differentiated by a few percentage points. By using a non-linear quantification process like a Fibonacci sequence or something like that, it helps accentuate the differences. Maybe artificially, but it at least allows you to be able to see that there are differences, and then you can talk about those with your client more effectively. And I found that to be helpful as well. So the next part of system analysis and control is about technical performance measurements, design margin analysis, simulation and modeling, and we'll get to traceability in a moment. But I think this is really critical as a systems engineer, is that oftentimes each of the individual contributors, mechanical individuals or software individuals, they will have solved the problem that was provided to them. The software people can send the signal. Mechanical people can move the motor. But when you bring these two things together at the interface is where some of the problems as well as opportunities arise. So by doing design margin analysis, you can look at either different components or different techniques to figure out where there may be limitations in performance, or how you might have to modify the parts that you're looking for or the approach you're looking for to actually meet your design objective. So in this case, what we've identified is the performance criteria is the gray box. In this case, component C in red, it cannot fully satisfy the entire performance criteria, nor can component B. Component A can. So systems engineer goes back to those necessary individuals and asks them to figure out how to make those red circles map to more closely fully envelop that performance envelope depicted by the gray, or potentially go back to the client and inform them of the challenges faced and see if there's alternatives that can be worked out. Verification. So verification and validation, what's the difference between these two? And for me, I think it was brought to me very early on in my career, which is when you talk about verification, what you're talking about is, does design output, does what we design, does it fulfill the requirements that we articulated to ourselves in the documentation? In other words, did we design the device correctly? Is it fulfilling its design inputs? That's slightly different than validation, which is, does it meet the user needs? Or did we design the correct device? I worked on a project where we passed verification with flying colors. Every attribute that was stipulated in the requirements worked as intended. The unfortunate thing is that when it was presented to the market, the requirements didn't meet the user needs, and as a result, the device did not take off. It was not the correct device to be designed. Many of you are familiar with the V model, where you come up with different levels of hierarchy for inputs, which are depicted on the left. Your user requirements, your system requirements, all the way down to the detailed software or detailed electronics designs. You have the implementation, and then you have on the right side your verification techniques, whether it be unit testing for the incremental software units, integration testing, which you test at a higher modular level, or system testing, which you do obviously at the totally comprised system level, and then acceptance testing, which would be the user validation. The verification is also a key part of what the systems engineer is going to provide value to, because they will understand how this tracing will work and what are the best places to draw those hierarchical lines and where the dependencies would make it easiest to verify, and who's responsible for that verification. So testing methods. There's 4 major testing methods that can be used for verification. And I like to try to provide some examples of these in terms of automotive, because sometimes many of us are more familiar with that, and it's probably a common understanding that we would have. So for testing by test methodology or verification by inspection, maybe let's see if the power windows, if the car has power windows. Does the car have an air conditioner? Does the car have a tow package? These are things that we can examine visually. Demonstration. Maybe there's an automatic switch that's supposed to facilitate the windows moving, or to make sure that the air conditioner turns on. We're not necessarily indicating that the air conditioner has a particular temperature of output, just that it should provide cold air. So this would be a demonstration technique for this verification methodology. Next would be test, which is maybe what many of us are most familiar with, which is we're actually going to measure something explicitly, have a quantified number, and evaluate that against a predefined metric. So in this case, the vehicle must accelerate from a dead stop to 60 miles an hour in a specific period of time, specifically 5.2 seconds or faster. So Teslas, as I understand it, they can readily achieve that. The vehicle I drive, probably not. Okay, but that would be something that you would utilize various different measuring techniques. That's the nice thing about this one, and there is no ambiguity there. It either will exceed that number or it won't exceed that number, and there's not a whole lot of ambiguity with that. And lastly is analysis. So in this case, what you might do is you might want to be able to determine if the car is going to have a particular reliability. So you don't necessarily want to take 50 cars and run them for 300,000 miles to figure out which parts fail. What you might want to do is measure various different portions of the vehicle, in this case, an engine for specific RPM, looking at vibrations, and then do an analysis through FEA or other mechanical technique or thermal modeling technique to determine if there are any components in the engine that would fail at a particular time due to fatigue and or thermal cycling. So that would be through analysis. You're not actually braking the motor, you're measuring things and doing a computational simulation to determine where failure points would theoretically be. So well, hopefully what I've done for you is I've outlined what the role of the systems engineer is, some of the tools the system engineer uses to do their job, and how they act as the glue, or as well as the chief engineer, to achieve the ultimate goal of coming up with a reliable product that meets the user needs, does it in a what's the word I'm looking for, predictable manner, so you're not surprised every Friday afternoon, and just every Friday afternoon you have a surprise. The system is going to help remove or reduce those surprises, and it's going to increase the likelihood of you having a successful product, not only meeting the technical needs of the product itself, but throughout the entire product life cycle, manufacturing, service, support, and so on. So at this point in time, I can open the floor to questions, and hopefully I can provide some answers.
Thanks, Bill. So there are a couple questions in the Q&A. If you want to stop sharing your screen, you can probably see those, but if you can't, just let me know and I can read them to you.
All right, let's see. I am seeing you, Rachel, right now, but I do not know if I am seeing.
No worries. No worries. Why don't I actually just read them to you, and then I can do it a couple times in case they're complicated.
Sure.
So why don't we start? So first question, what is the difference from a systems engineer as described in this presentation and a technical program manager?
So I would say it really depends on the technical background and capabilities of the program manager. So here at Sunrise, depending on what the project is, we oftentimes assign a technical program manager who has deep technical knowledge about that particular project. So for example, myself, I have a background in optics, lasers, imaging, blood processing. So several of the projects that I've acted as program manager on, I've also been technically responsible for making sure we coordinate the technical team. Now, that doesn't happen all the time. There's been other projects where there's been a tremendous amount of software, very detailed, and software may not be my forte. So in that case, I would have been more of a traditional program manager. So I would say, in my opinion, that a technical program manager, in my mind, is almost the best of both worlds, in that you have the systems engineering knowledge to technically manage the team, and you have the financial and scheduling information to be able to make those trade-offs for time to market, serviceability, manufacturability, cost benefit analysis, and so forth. So that's the way I don't see a significant difference between a technical program manager and a systems engineer.
Awesome. So must a systems engineer be a classically trained engineer, or can they be someone who's well organized, detail-oriented, a big picture person?
So I think that they definitely need to have a fairly good knowledge of many engineering disciplines. So if you are a very organized person, you will probably be a very good program manager. But if you do not know how to harness the capabilities of the electrical, software, and mechanical engineers, you may not be a very good systems engineer. I myself am not a classically trained engineer. I'm a scientist, but I've developed software. I've worked with engineers developing boards, although I could never develop a board on my own, God forbid. So I think that myself and many others at Sunrise, we've been doing development over all these different disciplines, and we have an understanding of how to harness the capabilities of each one of those different disciplines. There are cases, as I mentioned before, where maybe if I need, for example, someone who knows a tremendous amount about cloud-based software development, that's not my forte. So if they needed a technical program manager for that, that would not be someone like myself. But I think you do need to have someone who is very well, not only organized, because that's the risk management, that's the design documentation, that's the traceability, but they need to be able to understand how to harness those different technical fields.
Great. Okay. So when defining system requirements and subsystem requirements, et cetera,
Yep.
do you apply the same level of rigor to every project? So let's start there. It's a two-part question.
Sure. So I would say no. So the level of rigor is going to be determined by a number of things. One is, what are the risks associated with the high level system? All right, what are the, if this thing is going to be a surgical robot, that's significantly different than a device taking a picture of someone's fingernail for evaluation of certain medical conditions. All right, so that's probably a key aspect of it. How many different development partners there are is a large part of it as well. There is a second part of it, which is personal preference. I've worked with a couple different companies and within Sunrise, and sometimes the client will say, listen, just to make life easy for me, I know ideally we'd like to have 4 or 5 different levels of hierarchy, but I'd rather not do that. I just want everything in one master document, and we will accommodate that. So that does have trade-offs. The nice thing about one document is everybody knows where to go. The bad thing about one document is sometimes you have a tendency to step on each other's toes, and sometimes it's not explicitly clear where the interfaces are because they're all somewhat implied in the document instead of expressly identified in an exclusively identified or expressly identified in a standalone document. So I have my personal preferences. Obviously, I think standalone's better because you're more likely to catch those interfaces where I think the system here plays a key role, but the risks and the budget and the schedule play roles in that as well.
Okay, so part 2 of this question. How does your process change for early stage projects where there is a high technical uncertainty or a lot of unknowns?
So I think that's really where this process of the CEPI state and that engine is, instead of coming out with a waterfall approach, which is somehow with all this uncertainty, I'm going to be able to define the future with impeccable accuracy. I think what you try to do is you say, with your team and all the necessary stakeholders, what are the highest risk efforts that are going to impact the end goal that we're trying to achieve? And let's focus our times at mitigating those risks. First and foremost, let's prioritize them, and let's get our understanding of this project better in line with where we need to be. And by iteratively going through that steppy, you can try to educate yourself quantitatively, because ideally what you've done is you've compartmentalized this, numerically identified your risks, and de-risked them through some quantitative methodology.
Great. Okay, moving right along. We're going to keep these coming for you. There's quite a bit. Does architecture development happen after requirement definition in parallel to help define lower level system and subsystem requirements, or should be done after all the requirements are developed? So
I've never been on a project in 20 years where all the requirements were developed at the beginning. I know many people have thought all the requirements were developed at the very beginning through the waterfall, but invariably that doesn't happen. So that's why I had mentioned at CEPI, there's the iteration process. So you are going to need to start with requirements. Those are going to be market requirements, user requirements, and ideally system requirements. And then you come up with an architecture to satisfy those. You don't necessarily need to spend a lot of time with that, but by coming up with that functional block diagram that defines your overall architecture, then you and the other stakeholders can look at that functional block diagram and say, does this, you've arbitrarily defined the functional blocks. Does this definition of the architecture, can it satisfy business perspective as well as design perspective, how we're going to achieve our goals? And as you go through that, you might say, yes, originally I think we do have a solution. And then you go through the implementation process, and the system engineer may find out that there is something in the implementation process that adversely affects the architectures that's put forth. I think, again, the value of the system engineers, you're going to find those kinds of gotchas earlier than if you do not have a systems engineer. Because in my experience, where most of the gotchas occur are at the interfaces. mechanical people know how to move a motor and the software people know how to write code. It's when you're trying to do the two things together and there's somebody didn't understand what the disposable was supposed to do, that's where you fall down. So I think that it is an iterative process.
Great. Can you comment about INCOSE, INCOSE?
I have heard of that. I would need someone to refresh my memory on what that stood for, but I remember reading about that. So my apologies for not having a photographic memory.
No worries. If anybody knows, please feel free to put that in the chat. If there's a little description so we can jog memory, otherwise we'll move on to the next one and come back. Okay, so the next question. I've heard a lot about MBSE, especially in large defense projects. Does that fit into medical device development?
So the INCOSE thing, I think, is also has to do with either NASA or the defense industry. So the International Council of System Engineering, there we go.
Yeah.
So many of the ideas that I just mentioned are coming from those two organizations.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, so what's the difference between the system engineering and good manufacturing practices for medical devices?
So I think they'll go hand in hand, right? So the systems engineer is the person, again, that they deal with making sure that the interfaces are well defined. That ensures that your good manufacturing processes are followed, and it does it proactively. So if you do not have a systems engineer, you're more likely to run into problems that you then have to ameliorate, at the last minute in order to satisfy your good manufacturing processes. So it's a proactive person who is looking at these interfaces that coalesces the team around problems to address them before they catch you too far down the road.
Your traceability V model graphics, did those come from a standard or is that something you guys put together?
The V model has been out there for as long as I've been in the medical device industry. So I wish I could take credit for it, but it is well before my time. And it's a standard industry practice.
Cool. Okay, great. Okay, so a little bit of a longer question. Requirements are always evolving in a program, which is something obviously you covered earlier. At the beginning of the program, there's often a natural tension to push to start development before requirements are, quote unquote, sufficiently complete. Mm-hmm. Any philosophy on what sufficiently complete is?
That is a great question. So sufficiently complete is obviously arbitrary. The systems engineer has sufficiently complete somewhere over on the far right, and the marketing people and the business people have sufficiently complete somewhere on the far left side. And it is really a communication of trying to, and I think this is where the system engineer adds a lot of value, which is to be able to articulate to the various different stakeholders, what are the risks with moving forward without having X piece of information. Yes, we can move forward with the pump, not knowing what the disposable looks like, what it's made from, or how large it is. But if we do that, there's a certain point where we have to stop, or we may have to redo work. So if the system engineer is able to convey that information of risk and the ramifications of the risk, then people can at least make those choices open-eyed, right? So there's plenty of things that I do in my daily life and that we all do in our daily lives that is risk-based. I walk across the street knowing that there's a chance that that bus could come out and hit me, but I'm going to do it anyways, all right? But there's plenty of other things that I don't do. I'm a private pilot and I fly, and because of the style of flying, I choose to wear a parachute, all right? And I do that as an active measure. So that is the process of conveying to the necessary stakeholders, what are the risks and what are the rewards? And that's how that decision needs to be made.
That's great. And I'm really glad we're doing this because we're getting a lot of questions just about the differences between what a system engineer is versus other members of the project team. So what is the difference between a systems engineer and a design assurance engineer?
So to me, a design assurance engineer is someone who looks at the requirements and says, I see what the requirement is, and now I'm going to evaluate the design against that requirement. All right. And so the question, I guess, for me is, as a system engineer, is that requirement that we wrote down, is that the best way to articulate that requirement? Is that the best way to verify that requirement? And what ramifications does that requirement have on other aspects of the design? The quality assurance engineer, they may or may not have an understanding of the total system. So while they may be looking through the proverbial straw at this one aspect of the design, they may not understand what ramifications it has and ripple through the rest of the product. So the system engineer will help determine in a proactive manner how those requirements ripple through the design.
Great. Okay, just a couple more. Oh, this is a really good one. Is the risk evaluation process shared with the entire development team, or do you keep that as an internal tool used by specific engineers that provide the input? And then follow up quickly is, are mitigating actions and risks determined to not require mitigation typically justified to the bigger team?
So I think I'll say the first part again. I'll try to take this piecemeal. So repeat that first part again, Tracy.
Yep. Is the risk evaluation process shared with the entire development team, or is it just used as an internal tool by specific engineers that provide the input?
Okay. So the entire development team means to me, not only the engineers, but service personnel or service representative, a manufacturing representative, marketing, usability. And at the initial project inception, you're going to find the harms that can be potentially provided to the users, as well as, whether it be the patient or the operator. And the input's going to come from basically the primary stakeholders. In this case, would be manufacturing, service, and clinicians and patients, or their representatives. So those are the people that are providing the input to the risk assessment. Then what's going to happen is the individual contributors, with the guidance of the system engineer, will determine which ways to mitigate those risks. All right. Those risk mitigations, they may create risks in and of themselves that did not prior exist. So I'm in the process of doing that right now. There is a risk that a particular actuator will fail. We can determine that. I can put a sensor on that to determine that if that actuator fails. Good. However, what happens if the sensor fails? That wasn't something I need to consider before. And if some of these things may have ramifications for usability. So as we go through the risk management process, we will have to revisit with the larger team and convey this information to them. And that will be one of the roles of the system engineer, to make sure they communicate to the necessary stakeholders the things that impact those stakeholders.
And I guess then the second part, which is interesting, when there are actions and risks that are determined not to require mitigation, do you then justify that to the bigger team, or is that something that's decided and you just convey what needs to be conveyed?
So I think that would all be captured. Risks that do not rise to the level of requiring mitigation, that is still captured in a risk analysis or an FMEA. And that can clearly be shared with the stakeholders as the particular organization seems fit. Just a good example, if there is a small piece of plastic that were to crack on the enclosure and it has no bearing other than aesthetically, do we need to notify the patient representative? I personally don't think so, but you may want to provide that information to the marketing representative, because if your device has cracks prematurely, that could be bad and detrimental to your brand for reliability.
Okay, great. How does systems engineering fit into agile development?
So the system engineer is basically going to be the individual that is responsible for that iterative loop through the agile process. They're going to coordinate what are the requirements, how we satisfy them, let's do some analysis, let's do some preliminary testing, communicate with the internal stakeholders, and keep going through that iterative process. So that, to me, the driver of the CEPI engine is the systems engineer.
Great. Okay, so two more questions. Where does architecture end and implementation begin?
So that is an interesting question. I think that is somewhat dependent on the individual engineers. I'm in a program right now where because of the particular environment we're in, there is a lot more of what we would consider design detail in the architecture document. So architectures to me typically are high level, describing primary functional attributes that would be captured in a systems requirement document. So this all harkens back to a hierarchical document structure. So an architecture document to me captures everything in the systems requirement. It wouldn't necessarily capture in the systems architecture, what's the reset bit on processor number 3 in the electronics implementation diagram.
Okay, one last question. It's not out of scope, Michael, to ask this, but since there are potentials for new requirements along the design and development path, how do you typically quote projects for a customer, especially on sample sizes? How do you go about that process?
So I think that's again where I think a system engineer can be very helpful, because they should be able to look at the stated design intent from the client and to be able to determine, in talking with the client, are the things that the client thinks are going to change? Do they think they're talking about changing the product volume? Are they saying, I think that we might be making 100,000 or 1 million, or are we talking about 1,000 units? Okay. And understanding the volume of manufacturing or the serviceability environment, that helps make sure that we can design a architectural as well as implementation strategy to ideally accommodate changes to that. All right. There are many instances where there might be, maybe we will have a disposable, and there might be 3 or 4 different variants of that disposable. And these are the attributes of the disposable that will vary. All right. And therefore, the systems engineer, along with the rest of the design team, can architect that with that up front. The system engineer is not a magician. So if the client comes in and says, I would like my product to have very simple processor, and there's no need for any communication to the outside world, and you architect it accordingly and you implement it. And after you've implemented it, they say, well, I've changed my mind. I need IoT. I need to be able to communicate all the data up through the cloud in an encrypted fashion. If that wasn't known a priori and the customer explicitly said they weren't going to do that, can that be addressed? Surely. But that would be something where the system engineer would want to come up front and say, if we have an architecture that's not readily going to be able to support IoT, we want to bring this to your attention, because if you change your mind, this is the ramifications you're going to have down the road.
Great. That was our last question, Phil. You did great. You just did 20 minutes solid of questions. So that was really fantastic. And thanks to everyone for those wonderful questions. You're getting tons of compliments on the chat, Phil. That was outstanding. So thank you for putting this wonderful presentation together. And thank you to Sunrise for supporting MassMEDIC on this. Phil, we would welcome you back anytime.
Rachel, thank you for hosting this. Thank you very much.
Everyone, thank you for sticking with us, and have a great rest of your day. We hope to see you at another MassMEDIC program, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week.
Take care. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.